Hello, everybody, and welcome to another Adobe Live. I'm Maddy, and we are here on the 85th live stream for the UK today. And we've got a great guest here for you. Welcome, James.
Hello.
Hello. We are very happy to have James Popsys here. James is a photographer, and as you've seen already, we're going to be looking at some of the processes that James follows through Photoshop and Lightroom. But James, we've got a great audience today. Very good to see so many people here again. Just a quick shout out to everybody. Hi Kirsty, hi Gareth, hi Steve, all the way from New Zealand. Great to see you back here again. And Stuart as well. And of course Tim, who is in the background doing all of the magic for us today. James, how has it been for you, through lockdown? How's it going?
Not too bad, thank you. Bit quieter than usual, to be honest. Actually, I need to make a couple of quick apologies before we start. I noticed that this is called Live from the Sofa. I'm actually in my messy office because I've got a desktop, so I can't sit on the sofa, unfortunately. And also, this morning I had a spider run under my desk, and I'm not the biggest fan of spiders, and it ran up my leg. So if I scream at any point,
oh my gosh,
you'll know why.
You didn't put it out. It's in the room somewhere with you.
It's in the room somewhere, yeah. Which is the worst situation, I think. Usually, like I can't sleep if I know there's a spider in the room. So if I seem like I can't concentrate for any reason, you'll know why.
No worries. That's definitely a new one. I don't think we've come. I had a fly actually flying around, buzzing around the other day. Where I was trying to, get it out of my face. But no, spiders. Yeah, let us know. Amazing. But you are sharing some amazing photography. And what have you got in store for us today?
So yeah, I thought today I'd go through, probably quite briefly, some of my processes for how I kind of approach editing particular images in Lightroom, and then, if necessary, in Photoshop as well. Over the years, my processes has become predominantly more Lightroom based. And that's for two reasons, really. Lightroom, I think, has got so much more powerful over the past few years, but also my personal process has changed. So when I first started out in photography, I started like anyone else does. I got kind of the camera that I could afford, and I ended up going around the streets of London where I lived at the time, and I'd spend my weekends trying to find unique and interesting things to take photos of. And I didn't particularly have a huge amount of patience at that point, really, which meant that I'd come home kind of photoless at the end of each weekend, and I got kind of a little bit sick of it after about 6 months, and I thought, oh, maybe this isn't the perfect creative outlet that I thought photography might be for me. And it was only then, after probably, I'd say, I guess 6 months or so, I was browsing some photography blogs as I was doing at the time, and I came across a guy called Eric Johansson, who avid Photoshop enthusiasts will probably have come across. I've got his website up actually, and his work over the years has just been so inspiring for me, and particularly at that kind of 6 months point when I'd started photography and I was getting a bit frustrated at the fact that I couldn't find unique things to take photos of. Reading about Eric's process, and basically this is all just compositing and the use of layers in Photoshop, and this kind of opened the world of photography for me, really, because all of a sudden I knew that I was only really going to be bound by my Photoshop skills, which were nil at the time, but I had lots of kind of enthusiasm to improve, but B, my imagination. So I knew that the photos that I could create weren't going to be based on the things that were just in front of me in future. They could be based on things that I kind of created to more of an extent than most photography, I guess. So yeah, this guy had a huge impact on me. And so from here, I basically spent evenings and weekends learning how to use layers in Photoshop, which I guess we can go through a little bit today for anyone that doesn't know. And that basically became my kind of start point for really getting into photography. So fast forward probably 5 years from then, I was at a point where, with my particular composites, some of which I can show you, I've done a bit of a silly mistake in that I've shown you a complete master of Photoshop before I show you my stuff. But I was quite pleased with some of this. So we've got like a London Underground station in a Welsh hill, for example.
Oh, I love it.
We've got, what else can I show you? We've got a Wi-Fi sign in the middle of nowhere in New Zealand. So I basically kind of had started to come up with some of these things on my own. And I'd got to a point where I was attracting some paid commissions and stuff. So I wanted to start doing this as a career. About the same time, I'd started a YouTube channel though, as a bit of a marketing tool, as a way of showing tutorials on how I was coming up with this stuff. And at that point, I kind of realized that my dream of photography being this creative outlet and being the vehicle to enable me to spend much more time outdoors was going to be crushed by the fact that composites obviously take a huge amount of time to pull together, sat at a desk, as do videos, which meant that I kind of realized at one point or another that it was going to be one or the other. And luckily, about that time, and we're talking probably 2017-ish, early 2017, I'd been taking photos for so many years just for these composites that I kind of realized that there was an opportunity to kind of branch out into more traditional forms of photography, because my photos had got to a point where I was happy with them without having to bring any kind of composite element to them to kind of jazz them up or to kind of bring more creativity to the table, I guess. So in a roundabout way, that's kind of my journey so far, and that's how I've ended up using Photoshop a bit less, because nowadays I'd say 90% of the images that I shoot I can edit solely in Lightroom, but I will show perhaps one or two examples of where I do still jump into Photoshop.
Sure. And do you find that you go out and set up a new photo shoot to go and visit a new place, or are you relying on older images that you took at the start?
For these composites, or?
Yeah.
So when I was doing these composite photos, it was very much, in fact, I'd say it's 50-50 in terms of coming up with ideas based on images that I already had on my hard drives and coming up with images for ideas that I'd had. And the ideas came from, I found that with most kind of creative pursuits, and I think lots of people watching this will empathize with it, once you kind of start trying to think about something creatively, it gets much easier over time. You know, once you've had 10 ideas, the 11th is so much easier than the first. So it almost becomes a bit of habit in terms of how easily these ideas come to life. And so I guess, it was partly looking through archives of my own photos, but it was also thinking about ideas, just thinking about things like phrases or billboards or anything that I'd see outside that I could kind of think of a juxtaposition for, kind of meant that, you know, that turned into an idea whether I had the photo or not. And obviously if I didn't, then I'd go and start the collection process shortly afterwards. Yeah.
And the composites that you do, they're mostly in Photoshop, right? And you're tweaking the images in Lightroom.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And to be honest, to this day, that's the process I still use, which I can show with one of the images. I'll often, I'll start some tweaks in Lightroom if I need to make changes to things like exposure. But then after that, it's change everything that I need to in Photoshop and bring it into Lightroom to bring it into kind of my editing style, I guess. So all the finishing touches will always be made in Lightroom. Yeah.
Nice. And there was some appreciation in the chat for the shower cap on the gherkin image in London.
Yeah.
You shared. I think that was popular in the chat.
Let me try and find that one. I've got to go back to it.
Yeah, some great images in there. And you mentioned in the chat that we had just before we went live, you've mentioned that you've lived in lots of different places. And so do you find that you're really just inspired around what's around you, really, just to get out and take photos? Or?
I think so. Yeah, I think, so I turned 31 a couple of months back now. And somebody said to me, and I can't remember who it was, but they said that your 20s is basically a process of figuring out what it is that you want to do. And your 30s is about figuring out how you're going to do it. And for me, so far, that's absolutely been the case. So my 20s, we lived in a number of different places and kind of started down a few different paths, both in terms of careers and lifestyles that me and my wife wanted. And I think it's only now that kind of I'm getting to a point where I know exactly what kind of environment I want to live in, the kind of environment I want to work in, and the kind of photos that I want to be taking, and the environments that I want to be taking those photos in. And it's taken like a long period of time to get to that. And I think one of the biggest misconceptions that I find with kind of aspiring photographers and aspiring creatives a lot of the time is that there's this real push and pressure to find your style and to find your voice and to find what it is that you want to say as quick as possible, almost immediately. And the reality is, I think, that you've got to go through so many iterations of what you think is what you want before you actually fine-tune it and get to what it is that you think you will actually genuinely be happy with.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a journey that can't really be rushed. And I try and make sure that it isn't rushed whenever I kind of have people asking for advice who have almost been told, that message that it's important that you find your style as soon as possible, because that isn't an easy or fast process, and it's a process that should take a good amount of time. It's like fine wine, I guess. I know absolutely nothing about wine, but people tell me that it gets better with age, or some of it does. Some of it
well, that's
terrific with age.
That takes us to a comment, actually, that Stuart's mentioned in the chat, who says that you've mentioned your 20s and 30s, but what's next for your 40s?
Oh, good question. I'll be amazed if I haven't fallen off a cliff by that point, to be honest.
Oh, no.
I'm not, for somebody who classes themselves as kind of an outdoor / adventure photographer, someone who spends a fair amount of time in the mountains, I am as clumsy as they come. The number of times I'll be kind of vlogging, I'll be holding a camera, not concentrating on where I'm going on a mountainside, and I'll take a misstep, shall we say. It's not good. So I should have a harness on of some sort at all times, I think. But yeah, good question. If I do make it to my 40s, who knows? I'd like to think that I'd be continuing on the same road that I am now, because I've got to a point where I'm thoroughly enjoying what I do.
Yeah, and you're good at what you do. There's lots of appreciation for your images, and I love that St. Paul's image with the candle, with the flame.
Yeah, this one,
that's amazing.
Yeah, this one took a long time to work out how to do, and this was one of the earlier images that I worked on. So I was still very much it was all trial and error. And what I settled on in the end was that the dome that forms St. Paul's, I basically used a ping pong ball for that, and melted wax onto it, and then masked out the ping pong ball so that you see the wax coming around. As with all these things, I mean, I can talk about Photoshop and my process in Lightroom. I can say pretty much unanimously that all the processes that I use are far from being the best or most efficient ways to do things. And personally, as someone who, this is my business, but I don't really care too much if I don't do things in the most efficient way. If it costs me money because it's taken me more time, I tend to like doing things in a way that makes most sense to me, and in the way that I enjoy most. And if that is at the sacrifice of time or expending more energy, that isn't too much of a concern for me. And I can talk through an example of that in Photoshop, actually, when it comes to
let's jump in.
So here in Lightroom, so this is an image that I got in the Dolomites late last year, I think October time last year. And this is the raw file. It's not had any edits to it. To be honest, it looks a little bit underexposed. But if I just pull the shadows up, actually, it's not a terrible exposure. It's just the fact that it's a really contrasty scene. In fact, that doesn't look too good. Let me just let the image load properly. So that's my brother. I got to march up and down on this ridge about 100 times before I got exactly the right shot.
I hope you bought him a pint afterwards.
I did. I think I did. I hope I did. He didn't say anything. I assume I did. The problem with this image, so as I said before, 90% of the photos that I take, I don't need to do any compositing. Like, I can edit them with a few sliders in Lightroom. I like to think that for the most part, any image that you can't edit in 5 minutes, it's probably not a great sign for the image.
Right.
to be honest. I mean, that doesn't go for people who are complete beginners when it comes to things like Lightroom. Obviously, it's important to be experimenting. It's important to be taking your time. But if you're someone who's seasoned in the editing process, if you've got an image that you're really having to grapple with and really having to fight with to make it perfect, chances are it's probably not as gripping as you're trying to make it, is what I've found personally. Other people might disagree. But with photos like this, sometimes I get a scene that I absolutely love where there'll just be an element that I don't quite like. And in this case, it's the sky. So it looks like there's some kind of old vapor trails, old plain vapor trails, or maybe they're just kind of bands of high cloud. I'm not too sure, to be honest. Either way, around here and up here, they're not particularly to my taste. They're a bit ugly. And there's a number of ways you could sort this out, really, particularly in Lightroom now, because the heal tool and the clone tool, they're so powerful. I mean, I used to avoid those tools in Lightroom, and anytime I needed to do any cloning or healing, I'd do so in Photoshop. Now I don't necessarily feel the need to do that. I think Lightroom has got plenty powerful enough to be able to do it in Lightroom. That said, in this particular instance, a lot of the time what I try and do with a scene like this, if I can see that, for instance, the sky isn't exactly to my taste, I'll kind of look around the scene and work out if there's any other portion of sky that's a bit cleaner or a bit more dramatic, depending on what I'm going for. And so in this example, I turned probably, 60 degrees to my left, and I saw that there was a bit of sky that was plenty clean enough. So here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to select both these images, and I'm going to choose Edit In, and I'm going to go to Open as Layers in Photoshop, which hopefully at some point will bring them up in Photoshop. My iMac is being particularly slow at the moment, so fingers crossed. Oh, there we go. That wasn't too bad. So if anyone is unfamiliar with how layers in Photoshop works, basically, as you can see here in this control panel, I can choose to hide the top layer to reveal what's underneath. And I can also do this by painting over it. So if I go down to this button down here, add layer mask, then I can use brush and select black to reveal the layer that's underneath, to mask over the top layer. So it's black reveals, white conceals. Is that right? I always get mixed up. Black reveals, white conceals. Yeah, so if I then hit X to change the color to white, then I can conceal again. So in a nutshell, that's how layering in Photoshop works. And that is basically the premise of how I started my compositing, and the light bulb moment that was what kind of ended up in me trying to do lots of composite photography. In this example, I'm just going to get rid of this layer mask so I don't start to confuse myself. In this example, what I'm aiming to do is use some of this sky to replace some of these clouds that I'm not too fond of. So what I need to do is take this top layer and move it under the mountain layer, just for the most part, so I can see what I'm working with. And I'm going to make a selection of the sky. Now in this image, it's pretty easy to make a selection because the mountain is so jaggedy and so crisp that Photoshop will do a brilliant job, I'm sure of it, of selecting the mountain and leaving the sky. Yeah. He says, I'll do that again. Oh, that's happening because I've still got the bottom layer selected. So if I actually select the right image, it'll do it immediately. Now, to be honest, what I like to do when it comes to masking in Photoshop is I use a tablet, one of these things, not like an iPad. It's basically like a huge trackpad and a pen, and I'll physically draw the mask. So as I was showing before with the brush, you can paint away and you can add in with brushes. I'll do that manually, which is by no means the fastest or most efficient way to do things, but I find it really cathartic and just a nice way to spend an afternoon, basically. So it'll take me probably an hour to do that perfectly versus Photoshop, which will make a pretty much perfect selection. But I just enjoy doing it while I'm listening to music and I've got a drink with me. So that's how I've always done it. Costs me an absolute fortune in time, but I quite enjoy the process. And so for as long as that is the case, I'll continue to do it that way. Like I said at the top, I don't do things in the most efficient way. And that's important to say when you get into Photoshop, because as people who've spent lots of time in Photoshop will know, there are hundreds of ways to do absolutely everything.
So that's why Adobe Live is good, to see people's tips, because I've always used the gradient tool, and I kind of used to drag up to reveal the other sky behind, and use the paint tool to correct it.
Yeah.
But you're right, there's so many different ways. And there are some questions that have come in. I think people are keen to know, where did you do your training? That was from Catherine.
Training, all on a little known website called YouTube. So there was a good site back in the day. It might still be running. In fact, I think it is still running, called Flearn, which is spelled not FH, it's not an F, PH, that's what I was going for, PH, and then just Learn. So I guess it's Photoshop Learn. Fine. And that, as a site, was fantastic. They used to do daily tutorials. And for the most part, the tutorial was, for example, it would be how to mask out hair in Photoshop. And in a lot of cases, I wasn't particularly bothered about the exact topic that was being talked about in those videos. There might be 20-minute long videos, and I might not be all that interested in knowing how to mask out hair. But when you look at Photoshop tutorials, there's so much that can be applied to other instances that you can pick up on, regardless of what the exact topic for that particular tutorial is. So I found that after watching loads and loads of those, I just had this real kind of base knowledge of how to kind of proceed with lots of different things in Photoshop that I might have learned about in completely different settings, basically. So it was all YouTube and experimentation. So Photoshop is, I think, quite daunting to a lot of photographers, particularly people who are quite new to photography and find that Lightroom is so powerful now that you very rarely need to delve into Photoshop. I was quite lucky in a way that I found photography at a time when I, in particular, with the kind of photography I was doing, still felt a need to really familiarize myself with Photoshop, because I got the benefit of knowing exactly what it can do in circumstances where I still need it over Lightroom. I think if I was to come to photography now, Lightroom is so powerful and useful for so many instances that I'm not sure I would have all that much time to properly familiarize myself with Photoshop, because I very rarely need it. So it was really handy coming to photography when I did, and doing the kind of photos that I did, just because I got so much time to get used to Photoshop. So I've got this selection now, the selection of the sky, and if I go down to the add layer mask button again and hit it, you'll see that completely the wrong thing gets selected. To solve this, I can inverse the selection by hitting Command I, or I think on Windows it would be Control I imagine. And by doing that, that brings up my selection. Now, as you can see, that sky looks pretty horrid actually, and the reason for that is that the horizon is in completely the wrong place. So if I lower the opacity of the top image, you'll see that the horizon for the image below it is way down here, when in fact, actually, it should probably be, let's go to the move tool, it should probably be moved up to something like that. So if I up the opacity to 100% again, that starts to look a little bit more realistic. What you were saying before though about the gradient tool is really interesting, because I think I would go ahead and use that here as well. So if I was to go to the gradient tool, basically it's exactly the same premise as painting in the layer mask. So all you're working with is black and white, and anywhere that you've got white, you'll conceal. Anywhere that you've got black, you'll reveal. I'm going to get that wrong at some point in this call. But if I'm to draw a line with a gradient tool, straight from the bottom, straight to the top, what you'll get is a disgusting result, because I've moved this image up. In fact, that's not a very good example of it. I'll try that again. No, I'm going to do it one more time. So here, what we've done now, if you can see this layer mask, so black at the top, so we're showing everything at the top, and then gradually, because we've used the gradient, gradually we're showing the image that's below it. The problem with that is that obviously you cut off huge swathes of this mountain. It doesn't look realistic at all. So if I go Command Z to get rid of that, if I hit Command and this layer mask at the same time though, then I can invert the selection again. So I go Command I. No, I don't want to do that. What am I doing? Do I want to inverse the selection? I do, but I don't want to be on the layer mask because I don't want the mask to invert. No, I don't want to do that either. What am I doing wrong?
You've got it selected. Is that Command Shift I?
Shift I, yes, there we go. Perfect. It was in there somewhere. Then if I do the same thing I was doing before, but not on the top layer, on the layer mask, then I can start playing with the effect.
It looks better already. You can see instantly it makes such a difference.
Yeah. So, I mean, down here, for example, there are some clouds that I'd like to include from the lower image. And you can do that by playing around with the gradient mask. So it just gives you a whole load more flexibility being able to do that. And to be honest, even if you didn't want to use the gradient, you could just do so with the brush. I mean, you want a really soft brush. I don't know what the brush softness is here. Maybe it's 0. It is 0. So if you use a really big brush, then you can get much the same effect.
And James, as these are like recognizable locations that you're in, Brian asked a really good question. He said, when you're compositing, are you having to get property releases if you wish to sell images or print or publish them with books at those recognizable locations, like in London, for example?
Good question. So my understanding, and I'm not a legal expert, but my understanding is that whenever you are stood on public property, and it can depend. So if you're working with a commercial client from the off, then there are instances, if you're working in certain national parks, for example, where you will need releases and you will need permissions. My understanding is that for the most part, if you are working solely as kind of a lone photographer, as it were, and you're planning on potentially one day selling prints of particular places, you don't necessarily need permissions. But that can differ entirely from country to country, from state to state, from national park to national park. So it's always good to research specific instances wherever possible. But for the most part, if you're working from the off with commercial clients, and you're going to be working with assistants and producers, and you're going to need certain drone releases and all that kind of stuff, it's worth having phone calls with local authorities before you embark on any of those kinds of projects. So yeah, I mean, with this particular image from here, as I said, the selection in this case that Photoshop has made, I would probably want to refine. And the way that I would go ahead with doing that is completely manually with the tablet, as I mentioned. But for the purpose of this image looks great, and I'm much happier with the sky as it is than how it was. So I can show you how it was versus how it is. So if I just go disable layer mask, it's a really subtle change. But I think it just kind of softens the image a little bit. So if I suggest that I'm happy with that and I save, then I'll go back into Lightroom, and hopefully it should pop up in a second once it's saved. My iMac doing its thing, doing its slow coach thing. And here we go. So we've now got the file that I edited in Photoshop. And from here, it's a case of tweaking it to be kind of more in line with my editing style, which for the most part is what I'd probably describe as quite high key. So if I go for one of my presets, which is called High Key Punch, then the effect of that is way too much, I would suggest. So I use presets for a number of reasons, but the primary reason I use them, and the primary reason I would suggest other people using them, is as kind of questions as to how you should go about editing photos. So lots of people like to use presets as an answer to how their photo edit should go. So they will throw a preset onto an image and think, perfect, that's that done. I like to pose the presets as questions, as I said. So I'll be asking myself, when I look at a preset like this, is this roughly in line with how I see the edit going? And in this case, I think it is, but the effect is a bit too strong. There's a couple of ways I remedy that. So I like to use really strong presets because I can dial them down in one or two ways. Either I use a plugin, so there are a few plugins around for Lightroom that you can use to adjust the strength of a preset. I use one called Capture Monkey. So if you go to Photo in my, is it Photo? Bear with me. I've not used it for a while, so it's there we go. Took a while. So if you go to plugin extras and then the fader, the one that I use is called, and then that'll bring up a box whereby you can choose your preset or where your preset is from, which preset you like, and then what strength basically you'd like to apply it. The other way to make adjustments is just to do it manually. So once you've got a preset, you'll see all the adjustments that that preset has made to your image in the develop module. And you can then go about dialing down specific settings individually, which sometimes I like to do. So for example, in this photo, the texture is way too much. So I'd bring down the texture just slightly. I also think the image is a bit warm for my taste. So.
And Sanjana asks, how do you realize the photo is not too saturated? My eyes go blind while editing.
Yeah, that's a good one. And it's an interesting one. Lots of people, when they talk about over editing, refer to things like saturation and vibrance, because I think they are by far the easiest things to get a bit trigger happy with. So it can be really tempting, particularly when you start out in photography, to discover what all these sliders do and just to go way to the nth degree with them and take them too far. The best tip I have for that is that you need to give yourself space and perspective from your photos, particularly when you're not really experienced with them, or even if you are experienced, when you're just getting really excited about an edit, when you're really looking forward to editing a photo and you think it looks fantastic, it can be tempting to spend way too long with it. The answer to that, I think, is to drag yourself away from the image every now and then. So spend 5 minutes editing a photo, then go and make yourself a drink and come back to the photo. And it's amazing how when you do that, you'll come back to it and go, whoa, that's too much. The other thing I would say about over editing though is lots of people worry about it because there's lots of talk about how photos look a bit disgusting when they're over edited and how they're not to everyone's taste. But I think actually what, for the most part, lots of us are trying to do as photographers is to try and recreate what a scene says to us. So often when we're in places, we've got really fond memories of those places and those pictures, and the way the camera captured it doesn't kind of resonate with us in terms of the fact that we probably felt quite vibrant in some of these amazing places, and therefore increasing things like vibrance in the photo can kind of make sure that they're more in line with our memories. The problem comes then when other people look at them and say, oh, that doesn't look realistic. But the question has to be, does that matter? You know, is it important what other people think of your work if you don't like it to start with? It has to be to your taste first, because otherwise you'll end up just doing stuff for other people, and that is not a recipe, I don't think, for creative success in this kind of industry. Even if it's just as a hobby, I think it's so important that you value your work regardless of what other people think of it. So over editing in itself can be a problem, but so long as you're happy with the image, that's great. In order to understand if you're happy with the image, it's important to give yourself space and time from it in the editing process, because otherwise you will, more often than not, and I still do it, and I know lots of more experienced photographers than me still do this, they'll end up with an image that they've just taken too far because they've got too excited with the sliders, basically.
Yeah, it's easy to do that. And actually, that leads me into my favorite question, which is, if you won the lottery and you were to pack all of this in tomorrow and you were to live on a yacht in the Bahamas, what would you want to be known for?
Oh, catching big fish, perhaps, on the yacht. I don't know. It's a really good question. I've got to a point now where I'm really happy with the direction of what I'm doing with my career, and so I guess making photos that I'm happy with would be my answer, which is a nice place to be. Like I heard I think it was some sort of management podcast or something. It was random, you know, when you sat in the car and your podcast that you want to listen to ends, and invariably you can't really fiddle around with trying to get the next one, and so something else completely random just comes on, you end up having to listen to it because you don't want to pull over. So that happened, and there were these two guys talking about how they set the course for their day, and they were talking about how in the first 5 minutes of their day, it's basically like a plane. So in the first 5 minutes of a flight, I've never been an airline pilot, so I don't know this for sure, but for the first 5 minutes, you're busy making sure that your course is correct and that everything is working as it should be. You're setting the stage basically for the rest of the flight, where you're probably not going to do all that much because the plane is just going to fly in one direction. And I feel like I've got to the point in my career where I'm kind of at the last kind of 30 seconds of that first 5 minutes, where I've pretty much set the course, and now it's just a case of executing and continuing to do what I'm doing at the moment. So I think even if I had all the money in the world and lived on a yacht, I think I'd still have a hankering to spend my days in the same way that I've been spending my days to date. Maybe not the last 3 months or so. I'd probably want to spend more time outside than I have been doing, like all of us, the last few months. But for the most part, I'm pretty pleased with what I get to do on a daily basis. Yeah.
Good. And how do you find that you put yourself out there to get work? Like what is it like being a photographer in today's times?
Good question. I think I've always been fortunate in that I've always had, for most of my career as a photographer, I've had a growing YouTube channel, and I've found that as a marketing tool, there is nothing that comes anywhere close to having a YouTube channel as a marketing tool, basically, because if you're sticking a video out every week, it's a way to engage people, it's a way to find people, but more than that, it's a way to show what you're like as a person. And so from a client perspective, they get to see, it's almost like an interview, you know, they get to see how you work, what you're like as a person, whether or not you can be trusted with a budget. But even just from an audience perspective, you know, people get to know you a bit and they get to see how you spend your days, again, what you're like as a person. And so that really helps with just things like selling prints or books, or just making sure that they're engaged enough to come back and see what you're up to the next week. So I've got to the point now where my entire business is, I mean, the core of it basically is YouTube. I do lots of other stuff around it, but all of it pretty much comes from having a YouTube audience. And it was a lot of work to get to that position, but it means that I don't have to be quite so worried as I think a lot of other photographers who may be incredibly talented and may produce images way beyond what I could ever dream of producing. But even when photographers are in that position where they've got just incredible photos, they've still got to find a way to get them out to people. And for me, I found that YouTube takes a huge amount of that burden away. So I think by way of having a YouTube channel, I don't probably find it quite as difficult to get work as I no doubt would if I didn't have a marketing outlet like that. So, you know, having an audience means that you're not as dependent on doing jobs that you might want to do, doing jobs that you might not want to do, working with clients that you might not be over the moon to work for. And so, yeah, it gives you probably more freedom, certainly more freedom than I would otherwise have.
Yeah. And Siobhan asks, do you find most clients and jobs through your YouTube channel?
Yeah, I'd say so. It's also, I guess, it's another string to your bow as a photographer. For the last sort of 10 years or so, I've seen lots of people saying that, you know, if you want to be a photographer, then you should really know how to do video too. And I absolutely sympathize with that, particularly now that most cameras are to some extent hybrid cameras. You know, every decent stills camera that you can buy now also shoots 4K, also does slow motion, also has incredible image stabilization, which obviously benefits stills and video. And what that means is that you're probably missing a trick if you don't know how to do much stuff with video, because for the most part it's the same skills. You know, you're still ultimately working with light and subject and composition, and so it's not a huge amount more work to figure out how to produce videos as well as stills, even if at the outset it doesn't appeal to you as much as the stills does, which was certainly the case for me. You know, I was so daunted about the prospect of learning another program. So I edit in Adobe Premiere Pro. And actually, you know, once you've got your head around how to use Photoshop or Lightroom, it's much the same process. You know, you start out by watching a few tutorial videos, and then sooner or later you ask yourself, oh, I wonder what that button does. I wonder what that one does. And before you know it, you've got the foundation of a great bit of knowledge that helps you create something, and over time you build that knowledge. But yeah, I'd suggest that YouTube has been, without doubt, the way that I've got most of my work and got most of my opportunities over the past couple of years, certainly. And so I'd suggest it's a good way to go to try and ensure that, you know, you have a career that involves taking pictures, because it really decreases your dependency on other people and hanging around waiting for potential emails from clients or agencies that you hope are going to be the big jobs, because I think increasingly those are becoming kind of fewer and further between in lots of cases. So yeah, YouTube has been great.
And there is a question from Olufemi in the chat saying, do you use scopes or meters for colors?
No, not at all. No, I set my colors in camera. I mean, I always shoot raw, and I'll stick the contrast way down, I'll stick my colors way down in camera, and then I'll import images into Lightroom, and then I'll go from there. I'll use my presets, I'll use Photoshop. Aside from that, I keep things fairly simple. Yeah.
And then how long would you spend on this image that you're working on now? Because as you mentioned earlier, it's so easy to get, you know, trigger happy playing with the sliders and, you know, and you could definitely spend a lot of time in an
Absolutely. Yeah.
How long? Yeah.
Yeah. So now that I've done the composite element of the image, and to be honest, if I was to spend more time, I would probably look at this section down here as well, because I think actually, and I can probably demonstrate this, if I was to, come on iMac, you can do it, work. If I was to crop, say, something like this, for the sake of argument, that all of a sudden looks, to my eye at least, quite a lot more dramatic, because you start asking yourself, well, how did the person get there? How steep is that ridge? How isolated are they? Whereas the more of that you can see, the less of that you feel. So I might have looked at cloning out some of this stuff to make this ridge a bit more impactful. But once I've done that sort of stuff and I've brought the image back into Lightroom. I'm lucky with this particular photo in that it works quite well for the presets that I use. So all of the presets that I use are set up to work quite well with greens, yellows, and blues, basically images that have got some color and impact already. There are some images that I'd be editing from scratch that I wouldn't use a preset for, so I can show you one of those. So this is a photo that I shot last year in Arctic Greenland on, as you can see, a pretty cold day. And for this one, so what I love about Lightroom is that these sliders and all the stuff that you see on the right hand side in the develop module, these haven't just been thrown together, they've been put together really methodically. So for the most part, it makes sense to work your way through these in kind of the order that they appear on your screen. So this image, for example, I think could do with a slight boost in exposure, definitely a boost in contrast, because there's no contrast in the image. It's essentially a whiteout, as you can see. And then potentially a bit of a dehaze as well. And then there is some color, but it's just not particularly obvious, and which is where the vibrant slider really comes in.
Gareth, Gareth has asked in the chat, are you sending out your brother again for photographs?
No, fortunately this was my friend Ulanak, who is a Greenland native, and yeah, I didn't also drag my brother to the Arctic to freeze as a model. Thankfully, Ulanak is used to super cold temperatures, so he was more than willing to. Well, he certainly said he was. He's more than willing to go and stand out in the cold for me, which was much appreciated.
That really got me.
But I end up just freestyling a little bit with images like this. And that is, to be honest, one of my favorite things to do. When you've got time and, as I said before, a drink and you've got some music on, sitting and editing photos is undoubtedly one of my favorite things to do. And it'll just be, even with images like this, that I'm changing quite dramatically. I mean, already the difference in this between what it was to what it is now is pretty huge. And ultimately I've just moved, what, 1, 2, 3, 4 sliders basically. And then I might go and tweak colors as well. I might try and make colors even more obvious. But for the most part, it's really a case of a few minutes, I tend to find. And like I said before, if you're spending more time than that and you have some experience in doing this, in my experience, that is a sign that you're maybe chasing a bit of a lost cause. Here actually is a pretty good example of where I would trust the clone tool, where I perhaps wouldn't have years back in Lightroom. So you might be able to see there's kind of a streak that I think has been led by like a dog sled or something. So I'm just going to really roughly go over this and just see what happens. See what Lightroom does. And in this example, that looks pretty good to me. And like I said, historically in years gone by, I would have done all this in Photoshop.
Yeah.
So yeah, things like that in Lightroom and images like this are so easy to alter now just in the one program, and it's a real time saver, particularly for someone like me who, like I said, I'm not the quickest worker. So any time that the software helps me kind of, or protects me against myself in that it saves me time, is probably a good thing for me. Here's another good image actually to demonstrate the difference, or just demonstrate just how powerful Lightroom is now compared to what it used to be. So this is a great example of when I used to have to go into Photoshop to make changes that I now don't. So if I just make some tweaks to this image to bring it to life a little bit. So in terms of color, I'm relatively happy with this photo, but I think it would look a lot more dramatic if I could darken the sky a little bit. Now, traditionally what you'd do is you'd use the gradient filter You might bring down the exposure, you maybe bring down the shadows and the highlights. You just try and darken it, basically. The problem with doing that, as you can see though, is that you've got all these birds flying around and you're darkening all the birds as well, which doesn't look right. That wouldn't happen. The birds are being lit by the sun, the dark sky isn't. And so it looks odd if you've got really dark birds all of a sudden. In Lightroom then now, there's the range mask tool. So if I go to luminance, and in fact in this example you could do exactly the same thing with color. But if I select the eyedropper tool and just hit some of the blue, then I can make sure that only the blue is selected. And you can tweak this by playing around with the range. But that just means that the birds are no longer selected. They're still as white as they should be, but the sky is dark. And that helps make the image much more dramatic than it otherwise would be.
Yeah, it's such a difference.
So that's a really useful tool. And you can, so basically here, everything that's red is selected, and therefore you can make your adjustments accordingly. So that's an example of something that's been added to Lightroom in maybe the last kind of 18 months or so, I'd imagine, something like that, which is, yeah, I'd have had to probably go and play around in Photoshop before that tool to get the same effect, whereas now I don't have to. It's another thing that I can do in Lightroom.
Yeah, and do you find that, I mean, you care a lot about your work and you're happy with what you're working on. Do you find that you spend more time on paid work and less time on your own work? Or would you say that regardless of the image, you're going to spend the same amount of time to make sure that it's right?
Yeah, I think because of the way my business is set up now, there's not really any distinction between paid work and personal work, on the basis that I have an audience, and therefore there's a good chance any image that I work on, if I'm pleased with it, even if I don't have a client in mind for it, even if that image isn't sold, even if it's not already licensed to somebody else, there's a good chance that that photo might appear in maybe one of my books, or it might work well as a print. So I tend to treat all images the same in that regard, in that, yeah, there's a good chance that if I like the photo, other people will, and therefore it potentially will be able to work commercially for me, whether that's licensed to a client or marketed to my audience as a print or some kind of product, as I said. So yeah, I tend to take all images kind of as seriously as each other. That's not true, because like all photographers, most of the photos I take are fairly bad. And I think the art of certainly experienced photographers is hiding all the bad ones and only showing the good stuff, because not many people like to admit it, but for the most part, we're failing and occasionally succeeding, and we're just hiding the failures under the rug. And yeah, doing that successfully either on YouTube or by another outlet is the name of the game when it comes to what I do.
Yeah, and what's next for you? I mean, I know we've only got 7 minutes left, and the time has flown by today. Yeah, tell us what's next, James. What are your plans?
Good question. So I'm on the fence at the moment, as I'm sure a lot of people are when it comes to travel. I'm undecided about kind of what I think about it, how responsible it is, how safe it is. I really don't want to be stuck somewhere remote if all of a sudden flights are cancelled and lockdowns are put into place. For example, I don't want to be stuck in Arctic Greenland for a long period of time. So I'm unsure as to how to approach the next few months. And that kind of, to be honest, comes on top of wider concerns that I've had for a long time now about how much I should travel from an environmental point of view. So ultimately, my job for a good while now has been kind of jetting off to lots of different parts of the world, ultimately to get pretty pictures. And there comes a point where you have to ask if that is always the most responsible thing to do, or whether it's more skillful and commendable to be able to do that kind of closer to home, and whether that is kind of more representative of you and your life as well. So that is a question that I'm grappling with quite a lot at the moment, and perhaps the fact that we are in a bit of a lockdown and the fact that travel is a bit harder at the moment is maybe a bit of a sign that I should give that a go. You know, maybe I should be spending more time trying to get good photos in Wales and the Lake District, and going up to Scotland and playing around with the Dorset coast. And so that's on my mind at the moment. So I've got kind of workshops and things lined up for next year that are kind of all over the world, and I absolutely love doing those. But when it comes to me going away, just me personally, solely for the sake of my benefit and my photos, that's kind of what I'm grappling with at the moment. And that's where I might kind of change course a little bit, in that I might try and kind of do the work that I've been doing, but a bit closer to home, and try and really take on the challenge of doing that, because there's no getting around it. And one of the questions I get an awful lot, and one of the comments I get a lot on YouTube, is that it's all well and good being able to take good photos in incredible places, and there's no defense to that. Like, there's no doubt that it is so much easier to take great photos in places that are automatically awe-inspiring. And so pushing yourself and trying to improve your work in places that are, on the surface at least, less impactful, less impressive, less awe-inspiring, can only improve you as a photographer or as an artist, or whatever it is that your craft is. So yeah, that's kind of on my mind at the moment, and how I kind of go forward with that, I'm not sure. But maybe lockdown in some ways will help me kind of, it'll maybe help force that hand. Yeah,
and everyone's mentioning in the chat, you know, that I think CJ is keen for you to go to Scotland, and everyone's saying great idea, you know.
That's one of my biggest regrets so far is how little time I've spent in places like Scotland. It's ridiculous. You know, I've spent more time in places like New Zealand than I have in Scotland. Now, New Zealand is 12,000 miles away from where I live, and Scotland is a couple of hundred miles up the motorway. It's silly. So yeah, that is a perfect example of somewhere I'd like to spend more time that doesn't involve globetrotting, basically. So I have lots of intention to do that.
Snowdonia got a mention in there as well. Wales is beautiful, says Caroline. Ireland is amazing, says Catherine. Lots of love here. And your images that you shared at the beginning, you know, you've got a lot of the London images and where you put the underground and in those lovely Welsh, you know, scenic fields. That work is really good. So are you planning on doing more kind of work like that, and mixing cities?
I think so, because I do miss it. I absolutely do miss doing a lot of that kind of stuff, the composite work. And I miss kind of the idea generation. And like I said, I think in more ways than one, being able to create videos has replaced a lot of that, because that involves quite a lot of creative effort. So I don't feel like I'm kind of missing out on that outlet. That said, it's a lot of fun to do. So I think at some point or another, maybe particularly if I'm going to be traveling less, that's something I'll revisit. There's an awful lot of and anyone who's trying to craft a career as a photographer, or anyone in any creative field, I think people hear a lot that you need your own niche, and you need to develop your own style, and you need to be known for one particular thing. And I think to some extent there's some truth in that, but I also think that can be quite damaging to particularly people who are just starting out, in stopping them trying new stuff and other stuff that they might prefer or they might be better at. So I'm keen to not fall into that trap myself. You know, you get to a point sometimes, I think, where, like I was saying before, you're almost at a point where you don't need to correct course anymore, and you can just go ahead with what you're doing. And I think it's healthy every now and then to always ask questions about whether you could try other stuff, and you could revisit things you've done in the past. So yeah, that's a long way of saying I think I probably will try and do some more of those in future.
Fab. Well, it's been really great seeing your work today and having a look at some of the processes that you use, to create these amazing images. Lots of appreciation in the chat, as I've said. Everybody's saying definitely stick to the UK. Lots of mentions from Yorkshire to Cardiff to Snowdonia. So lots of things there. The chat will continue, everybody. So as we're going to finish the live chat now, everything will continue on Discord as well. So make sure you carry on the chat. James, thank you so much for sharing work with us today. It's been really great.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. It's been fun.
Yeah, it's been really good. And we'll see all of you again tomorrow at midday at the same time. Bye, everybody.